Thomas Wellington had served the royal palace for 23 years, and in all that time, he had never questioned an order. His polished boots clicked against the marble floors with military precision as he made his rounds, his eyes sharp and alert for any sign of trouble. The palace was his world, its corridors as familiar as his own heartbeat, and he took pride in every duty, no matter how small. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the East Wing as Thomas adjusted his ceremonial uniform. Today marked exactly 6 months since Queen Isabella's passing, and the palace still felt different without her gentle presence. The corridors seemed quieter, the staff moved with less spring in their step, and there was an emptiness that no amount of protocol could fill. Thomas remembered the day Queen Isabella had first arrived at the palace as a young bride, nervous and overwhelmed by the grandeur around her. Over the decades, he had watched her grow into a beloved monarch, someone who remembered the names of every staff member and always had a kind word for those who served her. She had a way of making even the most mundane duties feel important, and Thomas had developed a deep respect for her that went beyond mere loyalty to the crown. The queen had many passions, but none brought her more joy than her beloved Corgi, Buttercup. The small, golden-furred dog had been a constant companion for 8 years, following the queen through her daily routines with unwavering devotion. Thomas had often smiled watching them together during his security rounds. The queen would speak to Buttercup as if the dog understood every word, and perhaps she did. The bond between them was something special, something pure in a world often filled with political complexities and royal protocols. When Queen Isabella fell ill, Buttercup rarely left her side. The dog seemed to sense that something was wrong, becoming more protective and alert. During the Queen's final weeks, Thomas had been assigned to the medical wing, ensuring security while doctors came and went. He had witnessed many tender moments between the Queen and her faithful companion, moments that reminded him why he had devoted his life to protecting this family. The day the Queen passed away, Thomas was standing guard outside her chambers when he heard Buttercup's mournful howl echo through the corridors. It was a sound that would haunt him for months to come. The little dog had lost not just her owner, but her entire world. In the days that followed, Buttercup wandered the palace halls, searching for the Queen, her tail no longer wagging with its usual enthusiasm. The royal household was in transition. Queen Isabella's daughter-in-law, Margaret, would now take on many ceremonial duties while the grieving family adjusted to their loss. Margaret had always been more distant than Isabella, more focused on the formal aspects of royal life than the personal connections that had made Isabella so beloved. She was efficient and proper, but lacked the warmth that had defined the previous queen's reign. Thomas first noticed the change in atmosphere during the staff meetings following the funeral. Margaret's assistant, a stern woman named Mrs. Hartwell, began implementing new policies and procedures. Everything was to be more streamlined, more efficient. The casual conversations that staff once enjoyed with Queen Isabella were discouraged. The palace was to operate with greater formality and less personal attachment. During this period of adjustment, Thomas found himself paying special attention to Buttercup. The dog had been cared for by the household staff since the Queen's passing, but she seemed lost and confused. Her appetite had decreased, and she spent most of her time lying on the Queen's favorite reading chair in the library, as if waiting for her return. The sight broke Thomas's heart, reminding him daily of the profound loss they had all experienced. The other staff members had grown fond of Buttercup, too. Sarah, one of the housekeepers, made sure the dog had her favorite treats. James, the head butler, allowed Buttercup to sleep in the Queen's former quarters, despite new regulations about animals in certain areas of the palace. There was an unspoken agreement among the longtime staff that caring for Buttercup was their way of honoring Queen Isabella's memory. Thomas began incorporating visits with Buttercup into his daily routine. During his afternoon rounds, he would stop by wherever she was resting and spend a few minutes with her. He wasn't particularly a dog person, but something about Buttercup's loyalty and grief resonated with him. She represented the kind of unconditional devotion that he himself felt toward the royal family and the institution he served. As weeks passed, Thomas noticed that Buttercup's presence seemed to comfort other members of the household as well. When visitors came to pay their respects, many would ask about the Queen's beloved dog. Stories were shared about Queen Isabella's devotion to Buttercup, about how the dog had been trained to perform small tricks for visiting children, and how she had provided companionship during the Queen's loneliest moments. The palace photographer had captured numerous images of Queen Isabella and Buttercup together over the years. These photographs, displayed throughout the private family areas, served as poignant reminders of happier times. In many ways, Buttercup had become a living memorial to the Queen's gentle spirit and capacity for love. Thomas understood the importance of symbols in royal life. Everything in the palace carried meaning, from the placement of portraits to the choice of flowers in the gardens. Buttercup wasn't just a pet. She was a connection to Queen Isabella's legacy, a reminder of the personal touch that had made her reign so meaningful to those who knew her. One evening, while Thomas was completing his final rounds, he encountered Margaret walking through the portrait gallery. She paused at a painting of Queen Isabella, studying it with an expression that was difficult to read. For a moment, Thomas thought he saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by her usual composed demeanor. "The funeral arrangements have been finalized," Margaret said, noticing Thomas's presence. "We'll be hosting several diplomatic receptions in the coming weeks. Security will need to be especially vigilant." "Of course, Your Majesty," Thomas replied with a respectful bow. "We'll ensure everything proceeds smoothly." Margaret nodded and continued her walk, but then paused again. "Tell me, Wellington, what are the staff saying about the transition? I want to ensure everyone is adjusting appropriately." Thomas considered his words carefully. "The staff miss Queen Isabella deeply, Your Majesty. She had a special way of connecting with everyone. But we understand the importance of moving forward and supporting the family during this difficult time." "Yes, moving forward," Margaret repeated, as if testing the words. "That's exactly what we need to do. The palace cannot remain frozen in the past. There will be changes, Wellington. Necessary changes to modernize our operations and improve efficiency." After Margaret departed, Thomas felt a strange uneasiness. Change was natural after such a significant loss, but something in Margaret's tone suggested more dramatic shifts were coming. He completed his rounds with these concerns weighing on his mind, unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down. The next morning brought the first signs of the changes Margaret had mentioned. Mrs. Hartwell arrived early and immediately began meeting with department heads throughout the palace. New schedules were distributed, revised protocols were announced, and several long-time traditions were quietly discontinued. The staff adapted as they always did, but Thomas sensed an underlying tension that hadn't existed before. During lunch, Thomas overheard kitchen staff discussing rumors about potential staff reductions and departmental reorganizations. The conversations were hushed and worried, reflecting growing concerns about job security and the changing nature of palace life. These dedicated people had served the royal family for years, some for decades, and the uncertainty was deeply unsettling. That afternoon, Thomas was summoned to Mrs. Hartwell's office for what she described as a routine briefing on new security protocols. The meeting room was sterile and formal, lacking the warmth of Queen Isabella's preferred meeting spaces. Mrs. Hartwell sat behind a large desk, her expression businesslike and efficient. "Wellington, your service record is exemplary," she began, consulting a thick file. "Queen Margaret values experienced staff members like yourself. which is why I wanted to discuss some upcoming changes personally. Thomas listened carefully as Mrs. Hartwell outlined new security procedures, revised duty rotations, and updated reporting structures. Most of the changes seemed reasonable, aimed at improving coordination and response times. However, near the end of the meeting, she mentioned something that caught his attention. "There will also be changes to pet care responsibilities," Mrs. Hartwell said casually. "The household staff will no longer be expected to care for Queen Isabella's dog. Alternative arrangements are being made." "Alternative arrangements?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite growing alarm. "Queen Margaret feels it's inappropriate for palace staff to be distracted by pet care duties. The animal will be relocated to a more suitable environment where it can receive proper attention." Thomas's heart began racing, but he maintained his professional composure. "May I ask what kind of arrangement, ma'am?" Mrs. Hartwell's expression remained unchanged. "That's not your concern, Wellington. Your focus should be on your security duties, nothing more." The meeting concluded with Thomas feeling deeply disturbed by what he had heard. As he walked through the corridors afterward, his mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The phrase, "alternative arrangements," could mean many things, but given the new administration's emphasis on efficiency and modernization, he feared the worst. That evening, Thomas sought out Sarah, the housekeeper who had been caring for Buttercup. He found her in the laundry room, folding linens with unusual intensity. Her eyes were red, suggesting she had been crying. "Sarah, are you all right?" Thomas asked gently. She looked up with a mixture of sadness and anger. "They're taking Buttercup away, Thomas. Mrs. Hartwell told me this morning that I'm no longer to feed her or let her sleep in the Queen's room. They're giving her away to some family in the countryside." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Did they say when?" "Tomorrow morning," Sarah whispered, fresh tears forming in her eyes. "After all these months of caring for her, helping her through her grief, they're just going to take her away from the only home she's ever known. It's not right, Thomas. Queen Isabella would never have wanted this." The two stood in silence for a moment, both processing the reality of what was happening. Thomas understood now why the meeting with Mrs. Hartwell had felt so ominous. This wasn't just about efficiency or modernization. This was about erasing Queen Isabella's memory and influence from the palace. "Who's the family?" Thomas asked. "I don't know," Sarah replied. "Mrs. Hartwell wouldn't give me any details. She just said it was arranged, and that Buttercup would be happier in a more appropriate setting. But Thomas, you've seen how she is. She's not just any dog. She's Queen Isabella's companion. This palace is her home." Thomas's military training had taught him to follow orders without question, but his conscience was screaming that this was wrong. Buttercup wasn't just a pet to be relocated for convenience. She was a living connection to Queen Isabella's memory, a source of comfort for the grieving staff, and a reminder of the love and compassion that had defined the previous queen's reign. As Thomas returned to his quarters that night, he made a decision that would change everything. He had spent his entire adult life following orders and maintaining protocol, but some things were more important than efficiency and modernization. Queen Isabella had taught him that loyalty meant protecting what mattered most, even when it was difficult. The next morning would bring a confrontation that would test everything Thomas believed about duty, loyalty, and doing what was right. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he knew that his 23 years of unquestioned service were about to come to an end. But for the first time in months, he felt a sense of purpose that reminded him why he had chosen to serve the royal family in the first place. The palace slept peacefully around him, unaware that by dawn, everything would change. Thomas Wellington, the loyal palace guard who had never questioned an order, was about to take a stand that would echo through the corridors for years to come. Thomas woke before dawn, his mind already racing with what he needed to do. The palace was still quiet, with only the night security staff completing their final rounds. He dressed quickly in his uniform, each button and insignia carrying new weight as he prepared for what might be his final day of service. His first stop was the kitchen, where he found Buttercup lying in her usual spot near the warm ovens. The dog looked up at him with sad, knowing eyes, as if she understood that something was changing again. Thomas knelt down and gently stroked her golden fur, feeling the trust in her small body as she leaned against his hand. "Not today, girl," he whispered. "Not if I can help it." Thomas had spent the sleepless night formulating a plan. He couldn't directly disobey orders. That would result in immediate dismissal and possibly criminal charges. But he could delay the process, ask questions, and perhaps rally support from other staff members who felt the same way he did. Most importantly, he needed to understand exactly what alternative arrangements meant. The morning shift change brought the usual bustle of activity as staff members began their daily routines. Thomas noticed that several people seemed subdued, their usual cheerful greetings replaced by worried glances and hushed conversations. Word about Buttercup's fate had clearly spread throughout the household. At 8 o'clock sharp, Mrs. Hartwell arrived in the main foyer with two men in dark suits, strangers who clearly weren't part of the regular palace staff. One carried a small pet carrier, while the other held official-looking paperwork. Thomas positioned himself nearby, close enough to overhear their conversation, while maintaining the appearance of conducting routine security checks. "The animal is usually in the kitchen area during morning hours," Mrs. Hartwell was explaining. "The transition should be quick and efficient. Queen Margaret wants this handled with minimal disruption to the daily schedule." Thomas felt his jaw clench as he heard Buttercup referred to as the animal. This wasn't just about relocating a pet. It was about removing any trace of Queen Isabella's personal touch from the palace. The coldness of the language revealed the true motivation behind the decision. Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. She had clearly been crying again, but she walked with determination toward the group in the foyer. Thomas admired her courage. Sarah had always been one of the more outspoken staff members, someone who wasn't afraid to advocate for what she believed was right. "Excuse me, Mrs. Hartwell," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her emotional state. "I was hoping to get some information about where Buttercup is going. She has specific dietary needs and behavioral patterns that the new family should know about." Mrs. Hartwell's expression remained impassive. "That information has been provided to the appropriate parties. Your concern is noted, but unnecessary." "But she's been grieving," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "She's formed attachments to several of us who have been caring for her. Wouldn't it be better to wait a few more weeks, maybe find a way to gradually transition her?" One of the men in suits checked his watch impatiently. "Ma'am, we have a schedule to keep. Where is the dog currently located?" Thomas stepped forward, his heart pounding but his voice calm and professional. "Excuse me, sir, but I haven't seen any authorization for outside personnel to remove property from the palace. As head of security, I need to verify the proper paperwork before any transfer can take place." Mrs. Hartwell turned to face Thomas, her eyes narrowing. "Wellington, these gentlemen are here on Queen Margaret's direct orders. Your verification isn't required." "I understand, ma'am," Thomas replied respectfully. "But palace security protocols require documentation for all transfers of property, regardless of authorization level. It's a matter of maintaining accurate records and ensuring accountability." The tension in the foyer was becoming palpable. Other staff members had begun to gather, ostensibly going about their morning duties, but clearly listening to the unfolding confrontation. Thomas could see James, the head butler, watching from the doorway to the dining room, his expression grave but supportive. "Very well," Mrs. Hartwell said curtly. "Show him the papers." The man with the paperwork handed Thomas a single sheet of official palace letterhead. The document was brief and formal, authorizing the transfer of one canine animal to designated caretakers for the purpose of appropriate placement. It was signed by Queen Margaret and dated the previous day. Thomas examined the document carefully, buying time while his mind worked. The paperwork was technically sufficient, but it lacked important details. I notice there's no mention of the receiving party's identity or location. For security purposes, we need to know where palace property is being taken. That's confidential information, the second man interjected. We're not required to disclose our client's details. Actually, you are, Thomas replied, his 23 years of experience lending authority to his words. Any property leaving the palace must have a documented chain of custody. This is especially important for items with sentimental value or historical significance. Mrs. Hartwell's composure was beginning to crack. Wellington, you're overstepping your authority. This matter doesn't concern palace security. With respect, ma'am, everything that crosses the palace threshold concerns security. Queen Isabella's personal belongings have been carefully cataloged and preserved. Her beloved companion should receive the same consideration. Sarah stepped closer to Thomas, drawing strength from his stand. Mrs. Hartwell, many of us have grown attached to Buttercup over these past months. She's not just any dog. She's a part of Queen Isabella's legacy. Couldn't we at least meet the family who's taking her? We could share information about her habits and needs. This conversation is over, Mrs. Hartwell declared. Wellington, you will escort these gentlemen to retrieve the animal immediately, or I will report your insubordination to Queen Margaret personally. Thomas felt the weight of 23 years of loyal service pressing down on him. Every instinct told him to follow orders, to maintain the discipline that had defined his career. But as he looked around at the faces of his colleagues, people who had served Queen Isabella with the same devotion he had, he realized that true loyalty sometimes required difficult choices. I'm afraid I can't do that, ma'am, Thomas said quietly, not without proper documentation of the receiving party and a clear understanding of Buttercup's welfare. The foyer fell silent except for the ticking of an antique grandfather clock. Mrs. Hartwell stared at Thomas with a mixture of shock and fury, clearly unused to having her authority challenged. The two men looked uncomfortable, uncertain how to proceed in the face of unexpected resistance. Are you refusing a direct order? Mrs. Hartwell asked, her voice dangerously low. I'm requesting proper procedure be followed, Thomas replied. If Queen Margaret wants Buttercup relocated, then let's do it properly with full documentation and consideration for the animal's well-being. At that moment, Queen Margaret herself appeared at the top of the grand staircase. She was dressed impeccably as always, her expression cool and regal as she took in the scene below. The gathered staff immediately straightened, and even Mrs. Hartwell seemed to shrink slightly under the royal presence. What is the meaning of this commotion? Queen Margaret asked as she descended the stairs, her voice carrying the authority of her position. Mrs. Hartwell quickly stepped forward. Your Majesty, we're experiencing some difficulty with the arrangements we discussed. Wellington is questioning the authorization. Queen Margaret's gaze fixed on Thomas, studying him with the calculating look of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Explain yourself, Wellington. Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine not only his future, but possibly Buttercup's fate as well. Your Majesty, I've served this palace for 23 years, and in that time, I've learned that every decision reflects on the royal family's reputation. Queen Isabella loved Buttercup deeply, and many of your subjects knew about their special bond. How we handle her care after the Queen's passing will be seen as a measure of how we honor her memory. Are you suggesting that I'm dishonoring my mother-in-law's memory? Queen Margaret asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Not at all, Your Majesty, Thomas replied carefully. I'm simply suggesting that we ensure Buttercup receives the same thoughtful consideration that Queen Isabella would have wanted for any decision affecting her beloved companion. Queen Margaret continued down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the tense silence. When she reached the foyer, she looked directly at the two men waiting with their paperwork and pet carrier. "Gentlemen, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," she said. "You may leave. The arrangements have been postponed pending further review." Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Your Majesty, we discussed this matter yesterday. The decision was final." "Decisions can be reconsidered," Queen Margaret replied coolly, "especially when concerns are raised about proper procedure." The two men quickly gathered their materials and departed, clearly relieved to escape the uncomfortable situation. As their footsteps faded, Queen Margaret turned her attention back to Thomas and the assembled staff. "I want to speak with Wellington privately," she announced. "Everyone else return to your duties immediately." The staff dispersed quickly, though Thomas caught Sarah's grateful glance as she hurried away. Mrs. Hartwell remained for a moment, her expression suggesting she wanted to say something more, but Queen Margaret's dismissive gesture sent her away as well. When they were alone, Queen Margaret walked to one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. Thomas remained at attention, unsure what to expect from this unprecedented private audience with the Queen. "Tell me, Wellington," Queen Margaret said without turning around, "what do you think I should do about a security officer who publicly challenges orders from the royal household?" Thomas considered his words carefully. "Your Majesty, I believe that officer was trying to serve the royal family's best interests, even if his methods were unconventional." "Unconventional," Queen Margaret repeated, finally turning to face him. "That's one way to describe it. Another would be insubordinate. Yes, Your Majesty, that's a risk I was willing to take." Queen Margaret studied him for a long moment. "Why? What made Isabella's dog worth risking your career?" The question caught Thomas off guard with its directness. He had expected anger or immediate dismissal, not genuine curiosity about his motivations. "Your Majesty, Queen Isabella taught me that service isn't just about following orders, it's about protecting what matters most. Buttercup isn't just a dog, she's a symbol of the Queen's capacity for love and compassion. When people remember Queen Isabella, many will think of her devotion to Buttercup. Taking that away feels like diminishing her legacy." Queen Margaret walked closer, her expression unreadable. "You speak of Isabella's legacy as if it's under threat." "Perhaps it is, Your Majesty," Thomas said, knowing he was treading dangerous ground but unable to stop himself. Queen Isabella was beloved by the staff and the public because she made personal connections. She remembered birthdays, asked about family members, and showed genuine care for everyone around her. Changes that remove those personal touches might be efficient, but they also change how people remember this place and this family. The conversation was interrupted by a soft barking sound from the direction of the kitchen. Buttercup had apparently sensed the commotion and was making her presence known. Queen Margaret's gaze shifted toward the sound, and for just a moment, her composed facade seemed to crack. "She's been mourning," Queen Margaret said quietly, more to herself than to Thomas. "Yes, Your Majesty. We all have." Queen Margaret returned to the window, her shoulders slightly less rigid than before. Isabella was unique in her approach to royal duties. Some might say she was too personal, too emotionally involved with staff and trivial matters. "With respect, Your Majesty, I don't think any act of kindness is trivial. Queen Isabella's personal touch made everyone feel valued and important. That's why people were so devoted to her." "And you think removing her dog undermines that devotion?" "I think it sends a message about what this household values," Thomas replied honestly. Queen Isabella's final months were brightened by Buttercup's presence. The dog comforted her during illness and provided joy during difficult times. To those who served her, Buttercup represents that compassion and love. Sending her away feels like saying those qualities no longer have a place here. Queen Margaret remained silent for several minutes, staring out at the gardens where Queen Isabella had often walked with Buttercup. Thomas waited, knowing that his fate hung in the balance of whatever decision she was making. "Wellington," Queen Margaret finally said, "your service record indicates complete loyalty to this family. Today's actions seem to contradict that record." "Your Majesty, I believe my actions today demonstrate exactly that loyalty. I'm trying to protect something precious that Queen Isabella left behind, not just Buttercup, but the spirit of compassion and personal connection that made her reign so meaningful." Queen Margaret turned back to face him, her expression softer than he had seen since Queen Isabella's passing. "You're asking me to reconsider not just today's arrangements, but my entire approach to household management. I'm asking you to consider what Queen Isabella would have wanted," Thomas replied. "She wouldn't have wanted Buttercup to suffer or be separated from those who cared for her. She also wouldn't have wanted her death to mark the end of the warmth and personal connections that defined life in this palace." The tension in the room was shifting, though Thomas couldn't quite interpret the change in Queen Margaret's demeanor. She seemed to be wrestling with thoughts and emotions that she rarely allowed to surface. "You realize that your actions today have created a precedent," Queen Margaret said. "If staff members begin questioning orders based on their personal feelings, maintaining discipline becomes impossible. Your Majesty, I understand that concern, but perhaps there's a difference between questioning orders for personal gain and speaking up when something truly important is at stake. Queen Isabella always encouraged honest communication, even when it was difficult." Queen Margaret nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. She did value honesty, sometimes to her detriment. Isabella often said that the greatest danger facing the royal family wasn't external threats, but losing touch with our humanity. Thomas sensed an opening, a moment of genuine connection that might make all the difference. "Your Majesty, keeping Buttercup doesn't have to mean abandoning efficiency or modernization. It could mean finding a balance between progress and preserving what made Queen Isabella's approach so special." "And what would that look like, practically speaking?" Queen Margaret asked. "Perhaps Buttercup could remain in the palace but with updated care arrangements that don't interfere with staff efficiency. Maybe she could even serve as a comfort animal for visiting families or distressed staff members. Queen Isabella always said that animals had a way of bringing out the best in people." Queen Margaret considered this suggestion, and Thomas could see her mind working through the possibilities. The conversation had evolved from a disciplinary confrontation to something approaching a collaborative discussion. "There would need to be clear guidelines," Queen Margaret said thoughtfully. "Specific care responsibilities that don't conflict with primary duties and proper documentation of any arrangements. Of course, Your Majesty, the staff would be grateful for the opportunity to continue caring for Buttercup while maintaining the highest standards of service." Queen Margaret walked toward the door, then paused. "Wellington, your willingness to risk everything for a dog says something significant about your character. It also raises questions about my own leadership approach." Thomas remained silent, sensing that Queen Margaret was working through complex thoughts that went far beyond Buttercup's fate. "I'll be reviewing all recent policy changes," Queen Margaret continued. "Perhaps some of them have been overly focused on efficiency at the expense of other important considerations. Mrs. Hartwell will be instructed to develop new guidelines that balance modernization with respect for existing traditions." Relief flooded through Thomas, though he maintained his professional composure. "Thank you, Your Majesty. The staff will appreciate your consideration." "This conversation remains between us," Queen Margaret said firmly. "And Wellington, in the future, if you have concerns about policy decisions, I expect you to bring them to me directly rather than creating public confrontations." "Understood, Your Majesty." As Queen Margaret left the foyer, Thomas felt the weight of the morning's events settling on his shoulders. He had gambled everything on a principle, and somehow, against all odds, he had succeeded. But more importantly, he had opened a dialogue that might lead to broader changes in how the palace operated. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispered conversations and meaningful glances as word of the morning's events spread throughout the staff. By evening, everyone knew that Buttercup would be staying, and more significantly, that their voices mattered in shaping the future of palace life. Thomas found Buttercup in the library, lying on Queen Isabella's favorite chair as she had every day since the Queen's passing. But tonight, there seemed to be less sadness in her eyes, and more of the alertness that had characterized her during happier times. "Well, girl," Thomas said softly, gently scratching behind her ears, "it looks like you're staying home after all." As he prepared for his evening rounds, Thomas reflected on the day's events and what they meant for the future. The confrontation with Queen Margaret had revealed something unexpected. Beneath her efficient exterior was someone who genuinely cared about honoring her predecessor's memory and maintaining the values that had made Queen Isabella so beloved. Change would still come to the palace, but perhaps now it would be change that balanced progress with compassion, efficiency with humanity. And at the center of it all, a small golden Corgi would continue to represent the enduring power of love and loyalty that Queen Isabella had embodied throughout her remarkable life. 3 months had passed since the morning Thomas Wellington stood against the removal of Buttercup, and the palace had settled into a new rhythm that balanced tradition with necessary change. The confrontation that could have ended his career had instead become the catalyst for a transformation that surprised everyone, including Queen Margaret herself. The most visible change was in Buttercup's role within the palace. No longer was she simply Queen Isabella's grieving companion, wandering the halls in search of her lost owner. Under the new arrangements that Queen Margaret had personally approved, Buttercup had become something unprecedented, the palace's first official comfort animal. Her daily schedule was as carefully planned as any royal appointment, with specific times for visits to different departments and individuals who might benefit from her gentle presence. Thomas had been appointed as Buttercup's primary coordinator, a role that added unexpected depth to his security duties. He worked closely with Dr. Elizabeth Carr, an animal behaviorist who had been brought in to ensure Buttercup's psychological well-being while maximizing her therapeutic impact on the palace community. The arrangement was both practical and symbolic, representing Queen Margaret's commitment to honoring Queen Isabella's memory while adapting to modern needs. The transformation in palace culture had been gradual but profound. Queen Margaret had surprised many by personally reviewing every policy change that Mrs. Hartwell had implemented since Queen Isabella's passing. Some changes remained, particularly those that improved actual efficiency without sacrificing the human connections that had defined the previous queen's approach. Others were modified or eliminated entirely, especially those that had created unnecessary barriers between the royal family and their dedicated staff. Mrs. Hartwell herself had undergone a remarkable evolution. Initially resistant to the new direction, she had gradually embraced the challenge of creating systems that were both efficient and compassionate. Her organizational skills, when applied to preserving rather than eliminating personal touches, proved invaluable. She developed innovative scheduling systems that allowed for both formal protocols and informal interactions, and created documentation processes that honored traditions while improving accountability. Sarah, the housekeeper who had first challenged Buttercup's removal, had been promoted to head of household services, a new position that recognized her natural ability to balance caring for people with maintaining high standards. Her emotional intelligence and genuine concern for both staff and family members made her the perfect liaison between Queen Margaret's modernization efforts and the staff's need for meaningful connection. The changes extended beyond individual roles to the very atmosphere of the palace. Queen Margaret had instituted monthly staff meetings where concerns could be raised and discussed openly. She had also revived Queen Isabella's tradition of personal birthday acknowledgments and family inquiries, though she approached these interactions with her own distinctive style rather than trying to imitate her predecessor. Thomas often reflected on how the events of that crucial morning had revealed something important about leadership and loyalty. Queen Margaret's willingness to reconsider her approach when presented with compelling reasons had earned her a different kind of respect than her initial efficiency-focused management style. The staff began to see her not as a cold replacement for beloved Queen Isabella, but as a leader who was finding her own way to honor the royal family's values while meeting contemporary challenges. Buttercup's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. Under Dr. Carr's guidance, and with the loving attention of the palace staff, she had emerged from her grief to become a source of comfort and joy for everyone around her. Her daily visits to different departments had become anticipated highlights, and her presence during difficult moments had proven invaluable. When a young kitchen assistant received news of her father's illness, Buttercup seemed to sense her distress and spent extra time with her, providing silent comfort that no words could match. During the tense preparations for a major state dinner, Buttercup's calming presence in the kitchen helped reduce stress levels and improve coordination among the staff. Even Queen Margaret herself had begun requesting Buttercup's company during particularly challenging meetings, finding that the dog's peaceful presence helped her think more clearly and approach problems with greater patience. The media had eventually learned about Buttercup's new role, and the story had captured public imagination in ways that surprised the palace communications team. Articles appeared in newspapers and magazines celebrating the innovative approach to honoring Queen Isabella's memory while addressing modern needs. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, with many people expressing admiration for a royal household that could adapt and grow while maintaining its essential character. Letters arrived daily from families dealing with loss, thanking the royal family for demonstrating that grief could be transformed into something positive and healing. Children's drawings of Buttercup decorated the palace mailroom, and several requests came from other institutions asking for guidance on implementing their own comfort animal programs. Thomas found himself in an unexpected position as something of an expert on the intersection of tradition and innovation within royal service. He was invited to speak at security conferences about the importance of understanding the deeper meaning behind protocols, and his story became a case study in leadership programs about the value of principled resistance when important values are at stake. But the most significant changes were the personal ones that rippled through the palace community. James, the head butler, had initially worried that the new emphasis on efficiency would eliminate the personal touches that had made his job meaningful. Instead, he found himself working with Queen Margaret to develop new traditions that reflected her own values while honoring Queen Isabella's legacy. The monthly staff recognition ceremonies that they created together became cherished events that acknowledged both professional excellence and personal contributions to palace life. Dr. Carr's research on Buttercup's impact had yielded fascinating insights into the therapeutic value of animals in high-stress environments. Her findings were being studied by other institutions seeking to improve workplace well-being, and she had begun developing training programs for other potential comfort animals. The palace had become an unexpected leader in innovative approaches to organizational health and emotional support. Queen Margaret's personal relationship with Buttercup had evolved dramatically from her initial view of the dog as an inefficiency to be eliminated. She had come to understand what Queen Isabella had always known, that the capacity for love and compassion, whether expressed toward animals or people, was not a weakness to be managed, but a strength to be cultivated. Buttercup's unconditional acceptance and gentle presence had helped Queen Margaret access emotional depths that her formal training had encouraged her to suppress. The morning walks that Queen Margaret began taking with Buttercup through the palace gardens became a cherished part of her daily routine. During these quiet moments, away from the pressures of state business and public scrutiny, she found herself reflecting on the kind of leader she wanted to be and the legacy she hoped to create. Buttercup's presence somehow made these reflections easier, providing a sense of connection to Queen Isabella's wisdom and a reminder that strength and gentleness could coexist. Thomas's own journey had been equally transformative. The man who had never questioned an order in 23 years of service had discovered that true loyalty sometimes required difficult choices and principled stands. His relationship with Queen Margaret had evolved from formal deference to mutual respect based on shared commitment to the royal family's well-being and the values they represented. The security protocols he developed for Buttercup's various activities had become models for other innovative programs within the palace. His ability to balance protection with accessibility had proven invaluable as Queen Margaret sought to make the royal family more approachable while maintaining necessary safety standards. On the first anniversary of Queen Isabella's passing, the palace held a memorial service that honored her memory while celebrating the continued vitality of her values. Buttercup played a central role in the ceremony, wearing a special collar adorned with Queen Isabella's favorite flowers. The sight of the little Corgi sitting peacefully beside Queen Margaret during the service moved many attendees to tears, symbolizing the continuity of love and compassion that transcended individual lives. The day after the memorial service, Thomas was summoned to Queen Margaret's private study for what had become a regular monthly meeting to discuss palace operations and staff concerns. These meetings had become opportunities for honest dialogue about challenges and opportunities, reflecting the collaborative approach that had emerged from the crisis over Buttercup's fate. "Wellington," Queen Margaret said as he entered the comfortable room where she conducted much of her personal business, "I've been reviewing the reports on our various new programs. The outcomes have exceeded every expectation." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Thomas replied. "The staff has embraced the changes enthusiastically." Queen Margaret gestured for him to sit in one of the chairs facing her desk, an informality that still surprised him after months of their evolved relationship. "I wanted to discuss something with you that goes beyond our usual agenda. I've been offered opportunities to share our experience with other institutions, universities, hospitals, corporations, that are interested in our approach to organizational culture." Thomas listened with interest as Queen Margaret outlined various speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that had emerged from their palace innovations. The story of how a confrontation over a dog had led to positive transformation had resonated far beyond royal circles. "I believe you should be involved in these discussions," Queen Margaret continued. "Your perspective as someone who is willing to risk everything for important principles would be valuable to others facing similar challenges. Your Majesty, I'm honored by your confidence, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to advise other organizations." Queen Margaret smiled, one of the genuine expressions that had become more frequent as she grew more comfortable with her leadership style. "Wellington, you demonstrated something that many leadership experts struggle to understand, that sometimes preserving what matters most requires challenging existing systems. That's exactly the kind of insight that other organizations need." As their meeting continued, they discussed practical arrangements for Thomas to participate in selected engagements while maintaining his primary responsibilities at the palace. The conversation reflected how far they had all traveled from the rigid hierarchies and formal distances that had initially characterized Queen Margaret's approach. Their discussion was interrupted by a soft scratching at the door, followed by Buttercup's familiar bark. Dr. Carr appeared a moment later, leading the Corgi into the study. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Majesty," Dr. Carr said. "Buttercup seemed to sense that this was meeting time and insisted on joining us. Queen Margaret laughed, a sound that had become much more common in recent months. She has developed quite an ability to read schedules. Please let her stay. Buttercup trotted over to Queen Margaret's chair and settled at her feet, a position she had claimed during many of their meetings. The dog's presence had become such a natural part of palace operations that her absence was more notable than her attendance at various activities. As Thomas watched Queen Margaret absently scratch Buttercup's ears while discussing policy matters, he marveled at the complete transformation that had occurred. The woman who had once viewed personal attachments as inefficiencies had learned to see them as sources of strength and wisdom. The palace that had been moving toward cold efficiency had instead found ways to become more effective through greater humanity. The conversation eventually turned to future plans and ongoing challenges. Queen Margaret was working with international organizations to develop best practices for institutional change that honored tradition while embracing necessary innovation. The palace's experience had become a case study in successful transformation, though they all recognized that the work of balancing efficiency with compassion was ongoing. "There's something else I want to discuss," Queen Margaret said as their meeting drew toward a close. "The anniversary of Isabella's passing made me realize how much we've all grown this year. The staff survey results show higher satisfaction and engagement than we've had in decades, even during Isabella's time." Thomas nodded, having seen the remarkable survey data that reflected the positive impact of their new approach. "The staff feels heard and valued, Your Majesty. When people know their concerns matter and their contributions are appreciated, they naturally do their best work." "Exactly. And that's entirely due to the conversation you forced us to have that morning, when you refused to let Buttercup be taken away. Your willingness to stand up for what you believed was right changed everything." Queen Margaret paused, her expression becoming more serious. "I've been thinking about recognition for your actions that day. Traditional honors don't seem adequate for what you accomplished. Your Majesty, seeing the positive changes in palace life has been recognition enough. Knowing that we found a way to honor Queen Isabella's memory while building something new and meaningful, that's more valuable than any formal recognition." "Nevertheless," Queen Margaret continued, "your actions deserve acknowledgement. I'm creating a new position, Director of Palace Culture and Welfare. It would involve overseeing all our programs related to staff well-being, tradition preservation, and innovative practices. You would work directly with me on ensuring that our modernization efforts always maintain their human focus." Thomas was stunned by the unexpected offer. "Your Majesty, I'm deeply honored, but I'm not sure I have the qualifications for such a role. Wellington, you've already been doing this work for months. You coordinated Buttercup's new role, you've advised on policy changes, and you've helped bridge the gap between different perspectives within our community. More importantly, you've demonstrated the kind of principled leadership that this role requires." As Thomas considered the opportunity, he realized that accepting would mean formalizing the collaborative relationship that had evolved from crisis into something much more meaningful. It would also mean taking responsibility for ensuring that future changes preserved the values that had made their transformation successful. "I would be honored to accept, Your Majesty, if you believe I can fulfill the responsibilities effectively." "I have complete confidence in your abilities," Queen Margaret replied. "Isabella always said that the best leaders are those who are willing to do what's right even when it's difficult. You prove that quality beyond any doubt." As their meeting concluded and Thomas prepared to begin this new phase of his service, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all to this point. A single morning's decision to protect a grieving dog had led to institutional transformation, personal growth for everyone involved, and a new model for balancing tradition with innovation. Buttercup, still lying peacefully at Queen Margaret's feet, seemed to embody the success of their efforts. She was no longer the sad, displaced creature who had wandered the halls, searching for her lost owner. She had become a bridge between past and present, a symbol of how love and compassion could adapt to new circumstances without losing their essential power. As Thomas left the study and began his afternoon rounds, he carried with him a deep sense of satisfaction and anticipation. The palace had not just survived the transition from Queen Isabella's reign, it had discovered new ways to honor her legacy while meeting contemporary challenges. The staff worked with renewed purpose. Queen Margaret had found her own authentic leadership style, and the entire institution had demonstrated that meaningful change was possible when guided by clear values and genuine respect for human needs. The little Corgi who had once faced exile had instead become the catalyst for transformation that no one could have imagined. And the palace guard who had risked everything to protect what he believed was right had discovered that sometimes the greatest loyalty requires the courage to stand up and be counted, even when the stakes seem impossibly high. Walking through the corridors he had patrolled for over 2 decades, Thomas Wellington knew that he was no longer just protecting a building or following protocols. He was helping to nurture a living community that honored its past while embracing its future, guided by the timeless values of compassion, respect, and the enduring power of love to transform even the most challenging circumstances into opportunities for growth and renewal.